to share with you is some work that we've been doing in Wisconsin to try to get a better handle on the economics side of this thing. And before I get started, how many of you think that these mines are good for the community? Show of hands. How many of you think they're bad? Well, I'll tell you what, you're both right. Okay, because there are some, from an economic perspective, there are some positive things associated with these mines, but there's also some negative things. And I think the challenge for the community really is to try to make a decision about balancing those things. And what's right for some communities may not be right for other communities. But what we can do is that we can learn from other communities, and I think that's a very good idea, is to go around and see. There are some communities in Wisconsin that put these mines in place, and they're actually doing a very good job. That's the way to do it. And there's some mines that are not the way to do it. And that's one thing that a lot of Wisconsin community leaders are doing right now, is they're going around and they're visiting some of these different types of mines and see if we're going to allow these things to occur, this is how we want it to happen. Okay, so what are some of the things that we can do to kind of have our cake and eat it too? Okay, we put together a series of fact sheets, and the study down here in the corner here is what I'm going to be sharing with you. These are up on a website. If you Google UWEX, that's University of Wisconsin Extension, UWEX Buffalo Mine, they'll take you to this website. It's the Buffalo County office is where we're keeping this stuff. So you can download all these things. We got one, what's an economic multiplier, the stability issue, what do we know from the literature, and who's going to take the jobs. Okay, so this material is up there on the web if you want to look at it. Go ahead. Okay. Let me give you a summary of the findings before I kind of get into the gist of the analysis. First finding, mining as an industry has what is known within the literature as this flickering effect. Mining is very sensitive to the commodity prices of whatever it is they're taking out of the ground. Okay? Right now, generally, if the commodity price is above some certain level, the mines are generally operating at full capacity. If the price drops below some magic threshold, they shut the mines down, or they pull the mines back a lot. Okay? And this results in a flickering effect, or a tremendous amount of instability within the community. Now, and that's something that if these mines come forward, this is something community needs to plan for, is what are you going to do when you have these mines on, off. We're starting to see some evidence of that in Wisconsin already. A lot of the sand coming out of Wisconsin is going east to the natural gas fields of Pennsylvania. And what's happened to the price of natural gas? It's down. So what's happened to the new fracking that's going on for natural gas? There isn't any. Because the gas prices are down. So what's happened to the demand for sand? It's down. We're already seeing a lot of mines in Wisconsin, particularly the smaller ones, shutting down. We're also seeing a number of mines that are on the books to be open actually being delayed. So there's already evidence of this flickering effect that's occurring in Wisconsin. Okay? So that's one thing that we need to worry about. The second thing is the ownership structure of these mines really matters a lot. And again, I'm looking at the economic impacts on the community. The point here is, where are the profits going to go? We've had in Wisconsin, and I'm sure you're seeing the exact same thing, is a number of different mining companies coming in and making proposals. Some of these are local companies. Okay, we have Badger Mining. It's a very well-respected company in Wisconsin that has a tremendous track record. Okay, we also have a lot of companies coming in from Texas that nobody's ever heard of before. Okay, so there's two things here. One is, are these fly-by-night companies? Do we know if they're going to be around 10 years from now? In case something goes wrong, are they going to be there to fix their mess? But secondly, and more important from my perspective, is where are the profits going? If these are locally owned companies, the profits tend to stay within the community or within the region. If there are companies that are owned from firms that are outside, then those profits go away. Now, we live in a free market economy. You can't legally say, okay, you're a local company, we're going to give you a permit. Ah, you're from Texas, we're not going to give you a permit. You'll get dragged into court so fast, and you'll lose. But those are the types of decisions that you need to be thinking about. A colleague of mine did a big study on tourism. How many of you think tourism is a viable economic development strategy? How many of you think it's a rotten viable strategy because all you get are really crappy jobs? It depends on the ownership structure. If the tourism businesses are owned by local folks, then these can actually be fairly viable development strategies because the profits stay locally. If all these tourism events are owned by big national chains, you're right, all you get are the crappy jobs. Okay, same thing plays out here. Ownership structure matters. Next. There is a rather large economic literature looking at this. And it's coming down, and it's being called the resource curse. Now, there's some things that we can pull out of this literature, but there's some hesitation here because almost all of this literature is looking at very large mines in very remote areas, generally in places like Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America, okay, where you have huge copper mines, you have huge diamond mines and things like that. So whether or not what we're learning from those situations is transferable to here is kind of a question mark. Okay, so I'm sharing some of this resource curse literature with a little bit of a disclaimer here. Okay, but generally what that literature is saying is that the positive economic outcome for the local community generally is the exception rather than the rule. The economic impacts, the economic benefits that are promised by the companies generally do not play out. Okay. Second, these mines have a finite lifetime. Eventually, whatever's being dug out of the ground will be done. There's no more left. Well, except for sand around here. We could strip mine the entire western part of Wisconsin. We could strip mine the entire southeastern part. I mean, it's all sand down there. So, I mean, the resource is there for a long time. But generally, these mines have a lifetime. They will shut down. Now, one of the things that's coming out of this literature is that if you look at the community before the mine, and then you look at the community after the mine has shut down, the community's worse off after the mine is shut down. And there's all sorts of reasons why that kind of plays out like that. And we can get into that in a little bit. Next. One thing is you got to be careful to make blanket generalizations. A lot of times when we get into hot topics like this, it's right, it's wrong, it's black, it's white. But when we're talking about the economic impacts, it's shades of gray. It's very difficult to make a blanket generalization about whether or not these things are good or if these things are bad. It's shades of gray, and that's one thing that you have to really think about. Okay? For example, these are well-paying jobs. These are good jobs. They offer benefits. Okay? The problem, though, is that what the research suggests is that generally, the more dependent you are on mining, the poorer the overall health level is within the community. So you got a positive on one hand, and you got a negative on the other hand. How do you balance those two things? And what might be the right answer for one community may be the wrong answer for another community. Okay? Next. For remote rural areas that are more heavily dependent on mining for employment, will tend to have slower population growth, but there's consistent evidence that they'll have a positive impact on employment and income growth. Okay, so what we're seeing here is that what is higher dependence on mining, negative for population growth, positive for employment and income. What does that tell us? What that tells us is that these are job-generating activities. They tend to be good-paying jobs, but nobody wants to live next to them. Okay, so that's the kind of trade-offs that we're talking about here. Next. Okay, what we're looking at here is a growth index for the U.S. Okay, and the blue line is all employment. And you can see that from just after World War II up to, well, just the Great Recession, the recovery after the Great Recession, that there's been about a 200% increase in the amount of jobs in the U.S. This is, unfortunately, this is mining and logging. At this level, they lump them together. I can't break out just mining. So there's logging in here too. Okay, but look what's happening here. There's generally no growth in this sector. Okay, there's a little bit of a bump up here. What do you think that bump up was? No, that's 1980, 1983, 1984. Next slide. Next slide. Let's look at it this way. Rather than employment, let's look at contribution to gross domestic product. And this is adjusted for inflation, so this is real increase. Okay? The blue line is total gross domestic product. Mining is in the red line. Okay? Remember, very little growth in employment, but a lot of growth here in gross domestic product. Particularly, we can see the boom right there that we're starting to experience right now. How can you see such growth in output, gross domestic product, but no real corresponding growth within employment? How's that happen?
You're exporting the product.
Well, no. How do you produce it? More machinery. More machinery. Less labor, more machinery. It takes fewer workers to produce as much as before. Okay? Now, let's go back to this right here. What caused the recession, the bad economic times in the 1970s? What caused that? OPEC? Anybody remember OPEC? The oil shocks? What happened to the price of oil? Skyrocketed. What happened to the oil industry in Texas and Oklahoma? Boom, went through the roof. Okay? What happened to OPEC? It kind of caved in on itself. What happened to oil prices? They came back down. What happened to the oil boom in Texas and Oklahoma? Boom. Next. How many of you remember the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s? What caused the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s? You're smart. You see where I'm going with this. Okay? What happened is that in the early 1980s, we deregulated the savings and loan industry. The savings and loan industry was known as running by the 3-6-3 rule. They would pay 3% on passbook savings account. They would charge 6% on mortgages, and they'd be on the golf course by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Okay? Then they deregulated. And what do you think happened to these bankers when they deregulated? Particularly when you had an oil boom going on in Texas and Oklahoma. Speculation, ooh, fast money, gold rush mentality. What happened to the savings and loan industry? Boom, it blew up. The savings and loan bubble perfectly mimics what happened to the mining industry, particularly the gas and oil industry around Texas. If you look at all the savings and loans that went belly up, almost all of them were in Texas and Oklahoma. It was related to the mining industry, or not mining, it was related to the oil industry. Okay? Now you can see the most recent boom. Okay, next one. Yeah, right. This is month-to-month changes in employment. The blue line is total employment, and you can see it's kind of bouncing a little bit there. Mining and logging is the red one. What is that? Two things jump out at me with that. One is mining employment is highly unstable. Okay, that's that flickering effect. Okay, but something happened right after the oil and gas bust when the savings and loans blew up. You see more stability there, and I think that's the transition from more labor intensive to more capital intensive. Less labor, more equipment. Okay, so it's still an unstable industry, but not nearly as bad as it used to be. Next slide. Okay, so what do we got here? First, mining employment seems to be very closely tied to energy prices. Okay, and we're seeing that. Mining employment is inherently unstable, but as mining has moved more towards capital, machinery, and less labor, that employment instability is weakening a little bit, but it's still there, and we're seeing it in Wisconsin. Okay, now, what I'm trying to do here is I want to start to explore how is mining related to different measures of economic performance? Okay? And the way that I did this is that I'm looking at all the non-metropolitan counties in the US. So all these white spots here, those are all metropolitan counties. Okay? So what I've got here is the number of mining jobs per person, per population. The number of mining jobs divided by the population. Okay? Mining here is metallic mining, mineral mining, sand mining, all the types of mining except for gas and oil. Gas and oil is taken out because it's such a unique industry. Okay? So what do we got here? We got some counties where there's absolutely no mining taking place, none at all, there's not even a gravel pit. And then you got some counties where there's a lot. Actually, the biggest one is this one county in the middle of Nevada where there's nothing there except for a big mine. Okay? Now, so what do we see here? Well, there's the mountain, that's mineral mining. That's mostly coal, and the coal up there. And here's the Appalachians, okay? A little bit of the iron ore up north. But is this pattern, is this a random pattern? Is there actually what we call hot spots? Next slide. This is a little statistical tool that we use to essentially determine whether or not that pattern that you just looked at was a random pattern or if there's actually something there. These red spots are actually hot spots. Okay? There's almost all of Nevada is a mining hotspot. Okay? Because when you think about Nevada, you got what? You got Las Vegas down here in the corner. And then everything else is mining. There's nothing else there. Okay? You got mineral mining here. You got coal mining here. There's the Appalachia. Okay? Here's a little spot down here in southern Illinois. Okay? Southern Illinois used to be a big coal producing region, but it kind of slowed down because it's very high sulfur. Okay? When I lived in Macomb and I was an undergraduate, the guys behind us were old miners, and they used to burn coal to heat their house. And you could tell they were using Illinois coal because guess what the color of the smoke coming out of their chimney was? It was orange. You can always tell when the wind was blowing a certain way because you come downstairs and walk into the dining room. God, it's orange in here. They developed new technologies that they can actually start to use that high sulfur coal in there. So that industry started to come back. There's a cold spot here. There's no mining occurring in that area, and there's no mining occurring down there. Okay? So what I want to see is what types of social economic characteristics are associated with these more highly dependent mining areas compared to those that are less dependent upon mining. Next slide. So what we're going to do is that we're going to do some simple correlation analysis. And what we want to do is that we want to look at one variable here, and another variable here, and plot it and see what it looks like. The variable down here is that employment to population ratio. Mining employment to population. Okay? These other variables are just a range of different social economic measures that kind of describe the well-being of the community. Now, we can have a couple of different things. We can have a positive relationship, which means the two variables move together. This thing could be downward sloping, which means the variables move in opposite directions. Or we have what economists call the dreaded ball, which means there's no relationship. Okay? Now, we've got to be careful. We cannot say that this variable is causing that variable to happen. Okay? That's what we call causation. We cannot make that inference from this data. There's a famous study that did something like this, and they were looking at, I got my cell phone tied up. I pace too much. Okay, a famous study that looked at rainfall in Western Australia and the return on the US stock market. And guess what they found? Almost a perfect correlation. The more rainfall in Western Australia, the better the stock market did. So what should you do? Look at the weather forecast for Western Australia, right? Copious correlation. Okay, so we got to be careful in terms of how we interpret some of this stuff, but this is what we're doing. Okay, next slide. Here are some of the variables that we're looking at. Things like the poverty rate, children in poverty, income inequality, unemployment, violent crime, property crime. Let's go ahead, hit the next one. What do we find? Higher levels of mining employment tends to be lower poverty. These do tend to be good paying jobs. Okay, that makes sense. Next one. Lower levels of income inequality. Okay, they tend to be a more even distribution of income and a little bit higher because these tend to be good paying jobs. Oh, you went too fast. Higher rates of unemployment. Okay, why do you think that would be? It's that flickering effect. Okay, people go on unemployment. It's kind of natural. I work really hard for 3-4 months and then I'm unemployed for a month because of the nature of the industry. There's also a second phenomenon here in terms of people moving into the area in anticipation of working. When we were looking at the Crandon mine in northern Wisconsin, one of the big questions we had was who's going to take the jobs? Because there was a high unemployment in the area, and they were convinced if we build this mine, that it's going to lower the unemployment rate in the area. Wrong. What's going to happen is there's lots of research to back this up. You're going to get a lot of people moving into the area to take these jobs. Okay? A lot of these folks that are moving in are not employable, and it causes short-term problems. Okay? Higher property crime rates. No relationship on violent crime rates. Higher shares of people with a high school diploma. Part of what that is that these mines require you to have a high school diploma before they'll hire you. Okay? Lower share of people with a college degree. I need a high school diploma, but I don't need a college degree. Okay? So that makes sense. Now, what does this tell you in terms of other types of businesses that are in the area? Well, high school, that's good, but lower shares of people with a college degree, that's not good. That kind of goes back to that same thing, is that people don't want to live near these things. Okay? Next one. Health, some health measures. These are very gross measures. These are not specifically looking at silicon. This is just looking at the industry overall. Go ahead. First one, lower rates of youth without health insurance. That's a positive. Why? Because a lot of these jobs have benefits. Okay, next one. Higher rates of people with poor or fair health. This is a negative. Okay, there is negative consequences on health. Okay, how much of this is related to actually working on the mine? How much of this is a public health concern? We don't know. Okay, but there is a pattern there. Next one. Higher rates of people with poor physically healthy days. Again, there's a negative health connotation with these types of operations. Go ahead. And higher rates of people with poor mental health days. Would that be related to bad health? I got bad health, so I'm having a bad day. Or is it because, well, yeah, I'm speculating. I don't want to speculate. Go ahead. Okay? Some other measures here. Go ahead. Higher smoking rates. Causation, not check. Causation here. Do you think that having more mining is causing people to smoke more? Or is it the type of folks that work in mining companies are more likely to smoke? See, that's where that causation gets in there. Lower rates of obesity. Okay, well, you don't have a lot of people sitting behind the desk working. Go ahead. Lower rates of STDs. I have no idea why that is. Maybe it's the health care benefits. I don't know. I leave it in there because I think it's interesting. Lower teen birth rates. Those two things maybe go to lower teen birth rates. Maybe it's because, staying in high school longer, have access to health care. Maybe. Higher number of poor air quality or ozone days. Okay? So we got some positive things, we got some negative things. Okay, next one. Now, what I want to look at, that was just a snapshot in time. What I want to look at now is how does dependency on employment in mining influence future growth? So let's take a look-see at these counties in the year 2000, and let's see how they look over the next 7 years. And the reason I go up to 2007 is if I go to 2008, then I've got the Great Recession, and we got all sorts of noise in the data because of the Great Recession, so we just say, forget the Great Recession, we'll go to 2007. Okay? That's one thing economists are really good at. If you got a problem, assume it away. Okay? We looked at non-metropolitan counties. We looked at non-metropolitan that were adjacent to metropolitan areas. And then we looked at non-adjacent, or these are remote non-metropolitan counties. Go ahead. And what I'm going to share with you is the results for not adjacent. And the reason I'm sharing this is because for Wisconsin, most of the counties are not adjacent. And I'm going to go through every single one of these numbers. Okay? What this is, good. What this is that this is like that scatter plot, but on steroids. Okay? It's essentially a very sophisticated scatter plot. Okay? So what I want to zero in on is I want to look at these two things right here. Okay, so go to the next slide. Okay? Now, I've got two measures here. One is mining employment to a population ratio. That's the one that we've been looking at. Then we've also got mining employment as a share of total employment. Those two numbers should move together. Okay? But the reason that economists like to use kind of different measures is to see how sensitive our results are. If you use different measures and you get the same results, that gives you your results some credibility. If you measure things slightly different and you get different results, then you got to go back and think about what's going on here. Okay? So, what do we got? The results. Higher dependency on mining for employment in 2000 is associated with, go ahead, slower rates of population growth. Okay? That's what that negative sign there and there is telling you. The more dependent you are upon mining for employment, you're slower your population growth. People don't want to live next to these things. Okay? Next one. Faster rates of employment growth. Okay? They're generating jobs. Okay. Next one. Faster rates of per capita income growth. These are good paying jobs. So we're generating jobs, we're generating good paying jobs, but nobody wants to live there. Okay? Pros and cons. These are decisions that you've got to work with. Next one. So, what about that employment one? That employment one is a little, it's not a consistent result. The population result is very consistent. That always comes up that way. The per capita income result always comes up that way. The employment one is a little bit less, I'm less sure of that one. And the reason I think I'm less sure of that one is because I'm looking at, I'm going to set this up. Go ahead and hit the next one. Next one? Hit the next one. This is the study period. Okay? That's the study period. What's happening to employment in the mining industry right there? Next slide. It's going up. So I think maybe that employment result might be picking that upward trend. Maybe. Okay? So I guess what I'm saying is that I feel really comfortable talking about population. I feel really comfortable talking about per capita income. I'm not so sure about employment. Okay? Next one. So summary findings. Again, repeating here what we found. Mining as an industry in the U.S. remains inherently unstable. Okay? Although the flickering effect seems to be declining over time. Why? Because it's becoming more capital intensive, less labor intensive. The ownership structure really matters. Who is owning the mining operation? If you could legally say, we prefer to go with a local company and avoid those firms from Texas, do it. From an economic development perspective, I don't think you can legally do that, though. You'll get sued and you'll lose. But you see the logic behind it. Next one. Okay, the resource curse literature is really very negative on mining. Is really saying that mining is not a good way to go. But most of this literature is looking at really big mines in really kind of poor developing countries. And there's all sorts of reasons why these places they come out worse than beforehand, because a lot of these developing countries don't have things like labor standards. They don't have things like child work protection. They don't have things like environmental standards. They don't have things like health standards. Okay, so I'm hesitant to say what we learn from the resource curse literature is directly transferable to Wisconsin and Minnesota, but I think we can learn some things from it. Okay? Communities that are more heavily dependent on mining for employment tend to experience greater negative impacts after the mine closes than the positive impacts while the mines are in operation. One of the reasons for this is that oftentimes you don't see what economists call the multiplier effect occurring. When you see a big operation come in, whether it's a manufacturing firm or a tourist type activity, you'll see spin-off developments. You'll see restaurants popping up. You'll see retail stores popping up. You'll see personal service stores popping up. Okay? With mining, a lot of times you don't see that occurring. And the reason is because of the instability. Okay? People that are thinking of opening up a business because of this new activity that's occurring is less likely to do so because these mines flicker on and off. So a lot of times you don't see the multiplier effect that you would expect. And indeed, afterwards, you end up worse off. Next one. One gotta make guard against making blanket generalizations. There are some positive things attached to these mines. These are good paying jobs. Remote rural counties, again, the conclusion is slower population growth, but a positive impact on employment and income. Again, a negative matched up with some positives. Things to think about, things to consider. Are mining operations consistent with other sources of economic activity in the region? This is a really hot issue in western Wisconsin because so many communities are trying to promote amenity migration and tourism. Okay? I was at one town meeting where a town board chair, I felt sorry for him because you could just see the stress in his eyes. He said, we'd just gone through a community visioning exercise about 5 years ago. And what the community essentially said is what we value is the amenities, the wildlife, the green countryside, the farming, the quietness. That's what we like. But you got mines coming in offering to pay millions of dollars for a piece of land that's really not worth very much otherwise. What do? He was between a rock and a hard place. Okay? Not yet. On that one, the tourism component, the trucking. The previous speaker talked about trucking as an issue. As things have kind of calmed down in western Wisconsin, the one issue that people seem to be rallying around is the truck traffic. Ideally, the best mines that are operating in Wisconsin have a rail spur running straight into them. Most of the mines do not have a rail spur, which means that you've got a lot of truck traffic. Okay? The previous speaker was talking about the health implications of that and the safety implications of that. If a lot of communities are trying to promote tourism and amenity migration, right? How consistent is that with lots of truck traffic? Okay? In western Wisconsin, most of the main roads go straight through downtowns. Okay? What do you think the tourism event or the impact on tourism will be if you suddenly have a lot of sand trucks going up and down the main street all the time? It's not consistent. They're not compatible. So a lot of the discussion in Wisconsin right now is what do we do about truck traffic? Can we put in regulations on the truck traffic to minimize conflict? Okay, go ahead. The public infrastructure. These things are really hard on a lot of these local roads. Okay, we talked a little bit about that beforehand. One of the things that I saw in western Wisconsin was the number of towns that were not asking the mining companies for a contribution to a highway trust fund. And there was one company that came in and said, we are, as part of the package, we're willing to put in X $100,000 a year into a highway trust fund to help maintain the roads. And the town is like, you will? Why do you want to do that for? It's like, we depend on this road, having access to this road to be able to travel back and forth over. We need to maintain that road. We're willing to pay for it. Okay? Ask the companies to put in money to help offset some of these costs that are going to occur. Okay? Go ahead. Is there a sufficient pool of labor to meet the needs of the mining operations? This goes back to who's going to take the jobs. One of the things that we've seen is the number of folks, particularly truck drivers, that were leaving their one source of employment and going to work for the mining companies because they were better paying jobs and had better benefits. The problem then is the companies that they left are now having a hard time replacing them. There are examples of a couple of county highway departments that lost part of their crew and they can't replace them. They can't find people to replace them. And now a couple of these folks are now unemployed because the mine shut down. And hindsight's 20/20. Go ahead. Is the community making adequate investments to build on the economic activities generated by the mining operations? I just did an impact assessment of a proposed mine in very northern Wisconsin. And the economic impact, the multiplier, was very, very, very small. And the mining company was saying that the mining proponents, what's the economic multiplier that they're quoting you? Anybody? Every job in mining, there'll be X additional jobs. The number I've been hearing tossed around is 8, which is just flat out wrong. Anything that's bigger than 2, you should look at goofy. Okay? The economic multiplier for this one county that I'm looking at is 1.2. Now the reason that it's so small is that this is a very remote rural county. There's nothing there. There's the mine, there's trees, there's lakes, and there's summer homes. So even if you had all these high-paying jobs coming in, there's no place for them to spend their money. So a lot of these remote rural counties, if they're looking at promoting mining as an economic development strategy, it's not, oh, the mine is here, we're all good. You got to think about how to capture that economic activity. Next one. Is the community implementing strategies to adjust to when the mines close? What are the post-mine plans? These mines will shut down. What are the reclamation plans? Okay? What happens if the company goes bankrupt and you're left with an open pit? Okay, what plans are in place to reclaim the land once the mine is gone? Go ahead. Is the community learning from the experiences of other communities? That's what's going on in Wisconsin right now. It's going around and looking at some mines that are actually doing a pretty good job, and then some mines that are not doing a very good job. And the communities are trying to learn from what's going on in other places. Go ahead.